Good morning, everybody. I'm the token Australian now. Although my mum was Welsh, does that count? All I can say is Dydw i ddim yn siarad Cymraeg. That's about it. Which, if you don't know what it means I don't speak Welsh. So it's a very useful phrase to have. Okay, so we're here to talk about communication and literacy for the day, and I'll be up here twice, and the first presentation this morning is about communication, and this afternoon I'll talk about writing, but in between you've got some amazing people talking about the same topics. So, communication, the sky's the limit. One of the things we know about the individuals with Angelman syndrome that we work with, whether they're children or adults, is that many of them can make amazing improvements in their communication when we put good practice in place. And the biggest part of that is our belief that they can. The skills, the knowledge, and the mindset of everybody working with them is one of the biggest factors in how much progress they make. So just as all of the research, so I'm both a teacher and a speech language therapist in background, and all of the research into education says that the skill of the teacher is one of the biggest factors in the amount of progress their students make. It's also, we know, very, very important in AAC progress or communication progress. And one of the most important things that we know is that every single person has the right to communicate. So we do have a Communication Bill of Rights that's part of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peoples with Disabilities. And I think all of the countries that Tracy mentioned are signatories to that document. The Bill of Rights specifically that I'm going to put up next comes from a committee in the US which is called the Committee for the Communication Needs of Persons with Severe Disabilities, the Joint Committee, sorry, and it's frequently just called the Joint Committee. And so one of the things that they have done is converted this to a series of statements, and the wonderful Kate Ahern converted it to a poster for all of us. So all of us have the right to be heard. All of us have the right to say no. All of us have the right to make a choice. All of us have the right to give an opinion. And that applies to absolutely every single individual on this planet. I'm going to talk a bit about good practice in AAC, and I know many of you already know this information, but I just want to talk about it so that we're all on the same page to start with. So your quality standard for AAC services here has lots of great information in it. But one of the statements is that there are some key areas for successful implementation of AAC. And the first one that gets listed is modelling. And Tabby's going to talk about that a heap. But modelling is key. When we use their AAC system to talk to them, it's one of the most significant things we can do to teach them how to do it. Just the same as if we're trying to teach someone another language. The best thing we can do is talk with it so they learn to use it. We know that training for everybody, which is why you're all here, is another really important key factor, and training for the individual themselves. We know that communication partners, and that's really what I was saying earlier, every single person in this room, you are a really important part of the communication journey of everybody that you work with. Role models, meeting people who are already good users of AAC and seeing what they do and how they communicate. And then we all need ongoing support. And Angelman UK is really hoping that by having you all here, you can be informal ongoing support for each other as well. And then on top of that, we have a model called the participation model. And that's mentioned by the United Nations and by most countries in their statements around AAC implementation. And the participation model recognises that everybody is a communicator today, no matter how they're communicating. but that for every individual we work with, we have a vision for tomorrow. And tomorrow might not actually be tomorrow. Tomorrow might be 2 years away. But we have a vision for how we would like them to communicate. So if you're working with someone at the moment who communicates mostly by facial expression, body language, behaviour, how do you want them to communicate tomorrow? You want them to be able to communicate using picture symbols in a much more socially appropriate manner. You want them to move away from being an unconventional communicator to being a conventional communicator. You want them to use socially acceptable multimodal communication. So when they don't want to do something, to do that to you rather than something more extreme to get that across. And so we have a vision for where we want every person to be tomorrow. And what we're always keeping in mind is the things that we need to help them move to that tomorrow. And so that tomorrow, for most of those, includes all of those things in the second statement, with modelling being really important, every person in this room being really important, the training that you get, meeting role models and getting ongoing support. So, what we know is that there are ways that we implement AAC, or augmentative and alternative communication. I kind of assumed you all knew what that phrase meant. So that's everything we use to communicate other than speech or to augment speech. So I'm using AAC right now because I tend to do lots of hand gestures, and I'm using facial expression and I'm using body language. But most of the people that we're talking about need a lot more than I do to augment their speech. And for some of them, it's an alternative for speech because they don't have any speech. So what we know about delivering AAC is that there are a whole heap of things that are identified as good practice. And I'm not going to read everything on this slide out. These slides will be available to you, by the way. I'm not going to read everything on this slide out because we're going to be talking about this all day today. But all of these lead us to the point that communication is a human right. And so when we say communication, the sky's the limit, we honestly mean that. And what we know is that when we put good practice in place, we get a lot further towards the sky than when we don't do good practice. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So, our agenda, and I'm talking about our widely, hopefully everybody in this room, is that every individual with complex communication needs, so everybody who doesn't have enough speech to meet their daily communication needs, gets a communication system that enables their right to communicate. Because you can't become a better communicator if you don't own a system. But then, as the inventor of POD, Gail Porter, often says, there's no point owning a system if you don't use it. So we also have to believe in their ability to use language, and we give them a system that enables that use, and we put all of the things in place in their environment that support that to happen as well. And so we have to believe in their ability to learn language. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Anne Donnellan's article from 1981. It's called The Least Dangerous Assumption. It's referred to a lot in special education. It was considered a seminal article at the time, and it's still quoted, even though it's very old, it's still quoted all of the time. And what she talks about is the least dangerous assumption is that people can learn. Because as soon as I say, Rosie can't learn to communicate, I stop providing Rosie with opportunities, supports. I stop enabling her, and I start communicating by my body language and expectations that I don't have that expectation of her. So what we do is we believe everybody can learn when we put the right supports in place. And a critical part of that is implementing aided language input, so that's what we call modelling. So we're going to model using their system so they learn how to use it. And we're going to do other forms of language and communication teaching, and we're going to do lots of work to build their language up and their communication up towards tomorrow, because that's where we want them to be. And so everything we do in augmentative and alternative communication is about that participation model. We don't stop responding to their communication system of today. We're not going to suddenly start ignoring, for example, if you're transitioning someone from a PECS system to a more comprehensive language system, we're not going to suddenly start ignoring PECS. We're still going to honour it. But we are going to start modelling the heck out of the next system so that they can learn to use it, and so that tomorrow, which might be in 2 years, that becomes their language. And so then we start the cycle again. So if they've moved from a pod book to from a PECS folder rather to a core vocabulary system, then we think about what's the next thing they need. Do they need a more complex system? Do they need to learn little words? Maybe they're at the moment just communicating one word all of the time and they don't know how to combine 2 symbols together. So we're going to start modelling the heck out of that. And we're going to do everything we can to teach them to move to the next tomorrow. And so the participation model is actually an unending cycle where we're always looking at what they do today and honouring that as communication, and everything that we do is helping them move towards tomorrow. And all of the presentations today are going to be about helping get that tomorrow to happen. Because what we know is that if we don't have the skills and commitment required to help them move forward, then the system, the communication system, will be abandoned. It won't get used, and tomorrow will never come. And Annie would be very sad if tomorrow never came. Sorry, musical reference. So, one of the things that makes me very happy is being invited to come and talk here, because there's an amazing revolution happening in Angelman syndrome. So if you haven't heard about it, it gets referred to on social media and recently in a text by Stephen Calculator as the Angelman Revolution. And what it is it's an amazing group of parents who said, what our kids are being provided with is not what the research says is best practice. And what we want is we want that best practice. Because if we're providing less than best practice, then their outcomes are going to be lower. And so there is a history of children with Angelman syndrome being reported as not achieving very well with AAC. But what we know and have known since the early 90s is that best practice in AAC is that participation model. And that wasn't formally written up at that stage, but we've known for quite some time that we need to do what's called dynamic assessment. We don't assess someone and say, this is where they're at today, so therefore that's what we provide. Instead, we assess them. We say we're going to provide them with the tools and opportunities to move towards tomorrow, and then we're going to see how that worked. Because if we only provide them with the skills and opportunities based on today's performance, they're not going to move forward. And for many individuals with Angelman syndrome, that's been their history. They go in, they have an assessment, they can't perform on the day, and therefore they don't get the resources or tools that they need to move forward. But assessment is not static like that. It's not done. If it was, every baby that was born would never learn to speak, because we would never model speech to them. We would never model how to be good communicators. And so what we know is that that's a really bad form of practice. But unfortunately, that has been the outcome for many individuals with Angelman syndrome. And this amazing group of parents put their hands up and said, that's not good enough. The best practice in this world is to implement good AAC, do lots of aided language, train the communication partners, provide a diverse vocabulary, not just 3 symbols. And then, with all of that language input, they might learn to use 1. But that's what we know is best practice, and that's what we want for our kids. And as a result, we are now seeing quite a number of individuals with Angelman syndrome who are disproving all the old myths about what kids with Angelman syndrome can achieve or can't achieve, is a more accurate description of the myths. And so, I just want you all to join the revolution. We can walk out marching, if you hear the people sing, no. Got a thing about musicals, you might have picked this up already. So, we're going to use the participation model as our guide for everything that we do. We want them to not only become better communicators, we're thinking of long-term quality of life. We were talking yesterday, there was a lot of research in the early 90s. Janice Light and Kathy Binger wrote a whole book about it, around how many adults with complex communication needs feel very socially isolated. The term is they don't feel they've got social closeness, that everybody who interacts with them is paid to interact with them and they don't have friendships. And there's a lot written about if you don't have some level of social closeness, the impact it has on your quality of life. In fact, being able to have small social interactions with people daily is one of the best things apparently for lifting depression. Having deep and meaningful conversations occasionally with a close friend can be helpful, but not as helpful apparently as small social interchanges. And what they identified, what Kathy Binger identified, was that many adults with complex communication needs didn't have that language in their systems. And they'd never been taught how to do those things. So to have a small social interaction with someone, you need to be able to ask what's called a partner-directed question. You need to be able to say, did you sleep well last night? Tabby asked me that this morning when she saw me. I think I just looked haggard. She went, oh dear. But you need to be able to ask those small questions. And many adults who have complex communication needs weren't asking those questions. And so it's very hard to build or even start a friendship with someone if you don't have those tools at your disposal. And so this communication revolution is not just about needs and wants, because what we know is that most people can get their needs and wants met with a much smaller range of language, but that is not the significant part of our quality of life. Our quality of life is not about needs and wants, it's about all those social interactions. It's about making a joke at someone else's expense, it's about having fun. And you will see in some of the videos today how many of our individuals with Angelman syndrome can do that using a whole range of modalities. And so what we want to do is constantly think that our intervention is focusing not just on what they do today, but what their future communication needs are. Because it's about that long-term quality of life for every one of us, isn't it? And so always when you're working, keep today and tomorrow in your plans. So the way the participation model works is we have an initial assessment looking at the person's current communication needs and abilities. So if I had a student who was communicating mostly by facial expression, body language and behaviour, I might write a personal communication dictionary to support them with today. And so to make their communication clear, I might write that when Livy does, it means she wants a drink, that when Livy starts to pick paper up and shred it, it means she's getting distressed. And I will write what I suggest people do about that, and that might be my system for today. But then I need to do a detailed assessment for tomorrow, because Livy communicating in those ways is what we call unconventional communication. It means it's not socially acceptable for the rest of her life. It also is incredibly dependent on the communication partner to interpret it and know what it means. And unless you happen to have my personal communication dictionary, and I can't tell you how many of them I've written over the years that I swear no one has ever read, but unless you happen to read the personal communication dictionary I've read, you probably don't know that this means. And what we found when I was nearly 30 years ago, when I was a young speech language therapist, or speechy as we call them in Australia. When I was a young speechy, we'd sit down and have a meeting and I'd say, well, that means she's thirsty, and the next person would say, no, that means she wants to go outside. And then we'd think, how's she even going to move forward when we're all interpreting this differently? But the other part of this is we have to think about tomorrow. So what is going to help that individual move forward to tomorrow? And it is not just us responding to today, because if we just respond to today, they're not learning anything further. And yes, it will help if we all respond consistently to the same natural gesture with the same meaning, but it's not taking them any further. And that's what we want, isn't it? We want them to be able, in the end, to be able to communicate whatever they want to say to whoever they want to say it, wherever they want to say it. And if they don't get all the way there, at least somewhere towards it, more than just communicating by facial expression and body language. So we do our detailed assessment for tomorrow. Generally at this point, we need to think what's some AAC system that we can start modelling to help them move towards tomorrow. What's the system going to be? Is it going to be a pod book that I'm going to start using to talk with? I'm going to make them their own, of course, but I'm going to start using it to talk with, because until I start using it, they're not going to learn how. Is it going to be a core vocabulary system? But what we know is that that system needs to include quite a lot of language to build language. The old premise of let's use 2 to 4 symbols, what we know is that it's actually creating a language deficit. We don't do that with babies, do we? Can you imagine how little language development a baby would get if that's all we used? And yet it's a common premise in special education. Pat Miranda had a PhD student do a literature review on that premise, and there is not one single piece of research that supports it. And then once we have implemented that system, we re-evaluate. Are they starting to watch us model? Were they completely ignoring us in the beginning and now they're starting to watch us? My writing session this afternoon, you're going to see a young man who's come from a Syrian refugee camp, who has quite severe autism, who's now had about 18 months of AAC modelled to him. And at the beginning of the video, he takes my hand and he walks me over to a pod book and gives it to me. He's still not using it to communicate, but he's learned that his life is easier when he has that system around, because he can understand more of what I'm trying to say. And so we review, and then we make another plan for tomorrow, and we keep that process going. Now, a big part of that is engineering the environment. This is engineering the environment. If I keep talking at someone who doesn't use speech, they don't learn to use this just bang. We know sometimes it triggers a bit more speech development when we use AAC, but for individuals with Angelman syndrome, that is not generally something that happens. But to engineer the environment, we need to have some sort of comprehensive system that we start modelling. And then we need to think about how it's going to be with us all the time. So I have my strap that I wear. I have been known to forget to take it off and wear it to the supermarket. The worst day was when I had also yes-no cards round my neck, and I had the yes on this side and the no on that side. Yeah, and the man who came up and asked me if he could have the yes side. So it has become such a habit that I don't even notice it's there a lot of the time. In terms of engineering the environment, it's one of the most common things we say to people, is if it's not with you, you can't use it. So it needs to be there all of the time. And not everybody is comfortable wearing it like this. All of the schools that I work with, so I consult with about 30 special schools across Australia, and all of them we have pretty much compulsory, you've got to wear AAC that supports your students, and everybody wears them in different ways. So some teachers wear a little cafe style apron with a pocket in the front and it lives in the pocket. That does not suit my body type. And that's one of the things we've found, is that everybody has a different body type and we need to figure out what works for you. Some people like wearing like a big bib and the AAC hangs off the front of the bib. I find this really comfortable for me. But I now have a strap with a quick release that if a student pulls on it, it opens, because I learned I needed that. I won't explain how. So that's part of my engineering the environment. It's also about making it very clear that all of us are communication partners and our job is to put language in so that in the future we can get language out. Pat Miranda, who I've mentioned a few times, who is one of my gods, Pat calls it making deposits so we can get a withdrawal later. So we're going to do lots of deposits and we hope to get a nice big fat withdrawal later on. Engineering the environment might be about other things. So some of the students I work with really becoming great with a more comprehensive system, but when they're very heightened, they need a single page board, because when they're very heightened, flicking pages or an iPad heightens them even further, and then they cannot participate in that situation. So engineering the environment might be saying, okay, Michael's using Proloquo to go on an iPad, but when he's heightened, we have a single page aided language display that comes in. And so engineering the environment is about figuring out how's communication going to happen all day, every day. What are we going to do to get that going? When I was first a speech language therapist, which as I said is nearly 30 years ago, I was working at a very large special school in Melbourne in Australia. We had 400 students and they were allowed to stay at school at that point until they were 30. So we had big age range as well, although we didn't start as young as you guys start. We don't start till 5. So I was in a school in a team of 5 other speech language therapists. It was like heaven in retrospect. And I would assess every individual student, and I put a lot of time and care into saying, right, this is the student that B needs and this is the system that A needs. And I would consult the teachers and talk to them, but my focus was very much on what the student needed. Quite frequently, that implementation didn't go anywhere. And what happened was this thing that I called speech therapist syndrome, which meant that it only came out of the cupboard 5 minutes before I walked into the room, and then it went away in the cupboard again 5 minutes after I walked out. What I realised as I got older is that the students I worked with where it was very successful, it was because their team had the same vision. Frequently they're amazing parents, often incredible teachers. And so where I used to focus my intervention and my assessment primarily on the student, now I realise I have to engineer the environment around the student to get success. And that includes training for everybody who works with them. Not just a system. Just having a system is not enough. It's got to be about the implementation. And so these days I don't see much speech therapist syndrome, thank goodness. And we are getting so many more kids moving towards being independent communicators, which is the goal of all of what we do. So I continue to assess the kid, I get to know them. I continue to mostly use dynamic assessment these days, that constant intervene, then assess how it changed, intervene, assess how it changed. I now know how important a good vocabulary is. So in the early 90s when I started working, I did do lots of systems that were 3 symbols or 5 symbols. Do you have polyurethane? Do you know what that is? Yeah, like this really chemical paint that kind of seals stuff in. I used to bake batches of cookies and then polyurethane them so that the kids could use them as a symbol to request food. I've since learned I was a complete idiot. So there's this myth in AAC called the symbol hierarchy. It is a myth that objects are easier than picture symbols. It's been completely disproven. But when I first started working, it was what I'd been taught at university, and I thought it was true, so I thought I had to start everybody off. I bought little china toilets so they could use them to request to go to the toilet. And then in the early 90s, we learned that that actually wasn't a very good symbol because the kids didn't associate little china toilets with going to the toilet. That actually what they associated was toilet paper or the feel of the china that they're sitting on. And so then I was thinking, sheesh, how do I get china seats on their AAC system? But what we actually know is that that's not true. That whole hierarchy of symbols is a myth. That every beginning communicator, this is just as abstract as an object symbol. And it's about how many times we use it to mean its meaning. And that I could take a can of Pepsi Max and teach someone that it means more with just as much success as the symbol for more, as long as I use it repeatedly to represent that language concept. And it's a hell of a lot easier to use this than to carry around a china toilet seat. That around my neck as well would be a great fashion statement. So, we know that we need comprehensive vocabulary. We know we need at least 50 words in our system. That's the absolute minimum. 64, one study says. That if we're using fewer than that, we are actually really seriously causing a language delay and problem. And so we need our comprehensive systems to build enough language for kids to learn to communicate. So, I recommend and customise good comprehensive systems. It looks like a lot of language, but I can use this amazing pod book to communicate in pretty much every environment I walk into. I don't have to prepare the kits I used to have to prepare. I used to walk around with a trolley and I had my bubble blowing kit and my this kit and my that kit. I don't need kits anymore. I can walk into any classroom and whatever they're doing, I can join in. And we can get communication happening, because communication is all day, every day. And I can use this book to say something in every situation. I do need to make sure that some vocabulary is updated. I need to make sure that systems are maintained. This is my own personal pod book that's customised for me, and I have to refurbish it about every 6 months. I have to put a new cover on and a new coil because it starts to break down, and that's the same with the kids I work with. Sometimes some of the symbols start to wear off a bit and I need to reprint a page. I print it on waterproof paper that's also tear-proof, so that it's as durable as possible. And that's my preference rather than laminate, because when I used to wear a laminated one, my neck started to hurt because it's double the weight. And so when I'm talking about engineering the environment, there's a lot of factors I'm always thinking about. I want it to be as successful as possible. And if it's painful for me to wear this, guess what? I don't wear it as much. And so right from the beginning now, with everybody I work with, the environment, the people around the individual get just as much, if not more, focus than the individual themselves. Because every single one of you, every single family member, are all a really big part of the picture of the success for the individuals we work with. Now, a few years ago, I was involved in producing a poster with Assistive Wear, the people who make Promote Quota Go, called The Do's and Don'ts of AAC. So what I want to do is talk you through some of that poster. You can download the poster online, but I'm sure we can make it available with the notes from today too. Oh, there's copies of it at the Assistive Wear table. There you go. Awesome. So, David Nemaya, who's the, what is he, the CEO of Assistive Wear, the boss, the King Kahuna. David and I did a presentation at our Australian AAC conference talking about this concept of the do's and the don'ts. Because it's not just about what we should do, it's also about what we shouldn't do. Because sometimes things like thinking we only start with a few symbols are actually really detrimental to the kids. So we just wanted to specifically talk through both. And up front, I want to say what we're aiming for is communicative competence. So communicative competence, according to Janice Light and the more recent version from Light and McNaughton, consists of 4 sub-skills. The first one is linguistic competence. Do you know that you can point to a symbol to give a message? Do you know that the symbol means more? Do you know that you can now combine more with a second symbol? Do you know that after a while you can combine more with 3 or 4 symbols to get a different message across? So that's a slowly building linguistic competence. The next one is social competence. I'm not always the best at social competence, so I always worry about teaching it to kids. But this is where it's appropriate to say something and inappropriate to say something. It's also things like partner-directed questions, starting up a conversation, finishing a conversation. Operational competence, so in terms of if you're using an electronic system, do you know how to make the volume louder when you're in a noisy environment? If you're using a system like this, operational competence could be learning to clearly point so that people can see what you're saying more clearly than you just kind of wafting your hand across the page. And then the final one is strategic competence, which is making the best use of the vocabulary you have. So we know we are not going to put every word in English in any AAC system. A common one that comes up at home is Australian animals. Now, there are a number of Australian animals in this communication system, but we have terms we talk about a lot like nocturnal and diurnal. Now, put your hand up if you've used the word diurnal in a sentence in the last 20 years. Right, it's only me. And it's only because I keep talking about it in conferences like this. Put your hand up if you even know what it means. Right. So why would we put that in our kids? That's because you've heard it before, smart ass. So why would we even put that word in our kids' systems? What it means is awake during the day. You're actually all diurnal. I know. Now you can go home and say, hey, did you know I'm diurnal? So we're all diurnal, and nocturnal, of course, is the opposite, awake at night. Is it much more efficient to teach a kid to say awake at night and awake in the day, using the vocab they already have, than to add these really low frequency words that, let's face it, you only learn about when you're in grade 3 doing the Australian Animals unit, and you never hear again in the rest of your life. Well, you probably hear nocturnal, but not diurnal. So strategic competence is about teaching kids how to make the best use of the vocab they have. One of the schools I go to, a kid desperately wanted to tell his teacher not just that he wanted to go to the toilet, but that he wanted to do a poo. He wanted to be very specific that that's what he wanted to do. And he didn't know how to find poo in his Prologue Quota Go. So on the front page, he said, I do. Which was great strategic competence. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for. Now let's talk about the don'ts. So, first of all, don't expect the AAC user to use it without you modelling how. I made this mistake so much in the beginning. When I think about the systems I used to set up that I can't even use to communicate. And seriously, how often could I have used them in the day anyway? So when I used to polyurethane my biscuit and let my little china toilet, I would often do then a plastic cup. And so the kid would have 3 symbols on their tray. They'd have the biscuit, they'd have the toilet, and they'd have the plastic cup. How many times a day can you ask to go to the toilet? Especially if you're in a classroom where you're on a scheduled toilet roster. Great. How many times a day could they ask to eat? Well, they could ask repeatedly, but did they ever actually get it? No, because it wasn't meal time. And they could ask for a drink, and they'd occasionally get a drink, but then it became, oh, he's always pointing to the drink one. I think he's trying to get out of work. And really what a lot of the kids were just saying was, I want to communicate, but you haven't given me any language I can communicate with. If I gave you all that system, imagine how much you could say today. Not much. And really, does everyone want to know every time you want to go to the toilet? Maybe not. For the kids, it's different. But we need to make sure that we can model with the system. And these days, one of my biggest factors in evaluating whether a system is any good or not is, can I use it to communicate? So I used to review all the new AAC apps that came out on the App Store. And one of the things that I did was I took them on a plane with me. So I fly about every second week because I work with schools all over Australia. And so I'll often have a 2.5-hour flight to another state. And I would get on the plane and I would pretend that I couldn't speak, and I would use the AAC app to communicate. And occasionally there were journeys where all I could talk about was tiger and dog. There was one system that just had nouns and the biggest category was animals, but it didn't have dog in there. So if you try to use a system, you pretty quickly figure out whether it's usable or not. And 5 minutes into the journey, you give up and you start talking. So that's a big one. If you can't use it, how do you expect them to learn to use it? But also, you need to use it for them to learn how to use it. There are no such things as prerequisites. It's been proven again and again. There's a beautiful statement from Pat Miranda, I think it is. The only prerequisite for using AAC is being conscious. Don't give a system with just a handful of choices, and don't give a system that's got heaps and heaps of nouns. Again, that was the big mistake I made in the early days. There are so few things that we can use nouns for. If I build a system with words like more and finish and go and stop, how many times in a day could you use those 4 words as a kid? Lots. How many times as an adult modelling could you use those 4 words? Lots. And so you're much more likely to get them using that than if that's your system. How often can you say building? I can't even read it. Music. I think this is a tractor. I think that one's a computer. Yeah, anyway. There's very limited times that you can use most nouns. When you think about the first words that lots of kids say, those of you who've got your own kids, or if you remember your own first word, how many of you was it a noun? Mum is a common first word, or dad, but apart from that, it's often words like more, or go, or stop. My oldest brother's first word was give it. So we often, nouns are not a huge part. They don't give us a lot of control. Whereas teaching an individual to say more and finished and stop and go, how much control can that give them in the day? There are no prerequisites. So this is a quote from Erin Sheldon, who unfortunately was supposed to be here but had to cancel at the last minute. Erin talks very passionately about her journey with her daughter with Angelman syndrome. This is a quote that she put on the Quiet listserv, which is an assistive technology listserv. Her daughter was assessed again and again for AAC in a system where she walked into a room, she was asked to perform, and when she didn't perform, the system said, sorry, you fail, you can't have it. It's really poor practice. It is absolutely not what should have been happening. And when iPads came out with AAC capabilities, Erin decided to just shortcut the system and get her own system. And Maggie's communication started to take off. And not long after that, maybe a year later, she actually passed her first AAC evaluation. They finally said she had the skills needed to get a system. But the only reason she had the skills needed to get the system was because her mum had put good practice in place, got a system and modelled it. So, don't ask questions that the AAC user already knows you know the answer to. So again, I've been around for quite a while. If I told you how old I am, I know I don't look it. But I so clearly remember walking into a special school in Victoria, country Victoria, and being told, oh, communication group's on, do you want to come and join it? And the school had a series of AAC systems. This is not that long ago. They had a bank of AAC systems that came out twice a week. And the 10 kids in the school that they felt were ready for communication got pulled into a room and they got to use the system. And the first thing that happened in communication group was the teacher said, and what's your name, Michael? And what's your name, Peter? And what's your name, John? Yeah. You can imagine me sitting on the sideline observing this, thinking, now how do I tactfully say everything I need to say? But basically, don't ask them to answer questions they already know the answer to, that you know. I've been in rooms where they've been working on getting kids to use a good yes/no, where someone has said to the student, "And are you here today?" Don't think you always need to model grammatically correct sentences. Tabby will talk about this, I'm sure. But we often start with just modelling 1 to 2 symbols. We model the key symbols, and the general rule of thumb is 1 to 2 more symbols than the student is using. So if you're working with a student that's already using 1 to 2 symbols, you're thinking about tomorrow, and you're modelling 2 to 3 symbols. Don't force them to use their talker if they've communicated it to you very successfully using another modality. So one of the videos you'll see from me this afternoon is a student with Angelman syndrome who has just accused me of a very heinous act. It smells. Across the room, she's pointed at me and she's gone. She very successfully got her message across. I didn't do it, by the way. I really didn't. But it's her favourite thing. She's 12 and it's become her favourite thing to accuse everybody else of doing. And it turns into a real, it's very entertaining. But I'm not going to say, now you need to tell me that on your talker. We can talk about it. In fact, the person interacting with her in the video asks her to describe it. But we're not going to make her say it on her talker when she's successfully got her message across with all the other communication modalities available to her. I'm not a big fan of creating custom pages for specific activities. One of the schools I worked with in 2012 wanted the students to have a custom page for going to the canteen. You all know what I mean by canteen? Yeah. Sometimes I'm not sure if a word translates culturally or not. So they wanted the students to have a custom page for going to the canteen, and we had a big debate about it. Because what I wanted the students to be able to do was use the words available to them. They all had Prelope quite a go actually, the 12 students they were talking about. I wanted them to be able to use the words in their system to be able to say things like, I want that, before they learned to navigate to a page and press a pre-programmed button that said, I'll have a sausage roll, please. I wanted them to build that language skill, going back to that community of competence. I wanted them to be able to learn to put those words together in any situation to say what they wanted to say. We don't limit access to the system. It's not twice a week for 30 minutes. It's your voice. It's with you all of the time. And we don't have a huge focus on adding lots of vocabulary if it's already a well-designed system. We might need to add some, but like I said before, we're not going to add nocturnal and diurnal just because we're doing a unit on that for 7 weeks. So I've already talked about those slides. The limited vocabulary, I've already given you this example, but Professor Pat Miranda spoke at the International AAC conference in Portugal 5 years ago, and that's where she talked about how she'd had a student do a literature review and that they could not find a single piece of research supporting that mindset of starting with just 4 to 6 icons or 4 to 6 symbols. We don't want to use the system to quiz kids or test kids. It's about communication. I think I've already said most of those. I'm not a big fan of rewarding communication with food. I think that extrinsic motivation thing is a big problem for a lot of kids. Once they start getting an extrinsic motivator for doing a task, they expect it every time they do the task. There's some amazing research with neurotypical kids where they had a class of kids, about 7-year-olds, who really enjoyed drawing, and another class who really enjoyed drawing, and they started paying the first class to colour in and draw. And they did it for a few weeks, and then at the end of the few weeks they stopped and they measured how much the kids were doing it afterwards, and they already had a measurement from before, and the kids who got paid stopped doing it because they were no longer getting paid. And so all of that just makes me very wary of extrinsic motivators. And as I've said, we don't want them to have to say it with their words. This is a video of someone using an AAC for testing, but I'm actually going to skip it.
Okay, tell me on here. Tell me on here. Okay.
Okay, I am going to skip it because we're running behind. I'm running behind. And so AAC is about teaching, not testing. So the do's. Do use the system to talk yourself. Aim high. Use a well-designed comprehensive vocabulary. Provide enough wait time. Do ask open-ended questions. Focus on keywords when modelling. Respect their multimodal communication. Allow them to explore and access the vocabulary. One of the things that I sometimes come across is people say, well, we've taken the system off him because all he does is press the buttons. When you get a new thing, what do? You explore it. And so sometimes we just need to allow them to explore. And then they need to learn that there are times when they don't talk and there are times when we talk. And that's the same for all of the talking kids in our classrooms. We need to make sure AAC is always there, and we're going to describe words that aren't in the system rather than adding new words. In terms of success, we know that there are some factors that impact our long-term success, and the first one is that the AAC user themselves experience success. So if you think back to the systems I used to do with my 3 object symbols of drink, toilet and eat with the cookie, if every time they pointed to eat, someone said, oh, it's not time to eat yet, you can't eat. And every time they pointed to toilet, they'd say, oh, you're not on the roster yet. Are they experiencing success? No. We had a consultant come to one of my schools who we were doing great AAC practice. The consultant was a behaviourist and came in and said, I'd like at lunchtime that every kid requests their food. They get 4 mouthfuls and then they have to request it again. And we suddenly had a massive increase in challenging behaviour at lunchtime. Why? Why do we have to do that? There were kids who were completely independently eating their lunch. Can you imagine if someone did that to you with your lunch? Now you're not going to get your next mouthful till you ask me for it. You'd probably have an increase in challenging behaviour too. The degree to which the system is valued by the user and their partners. That the system serves a variety of communicative functions. It can't just be for requesting. They need to be able to comment, they need to be able to greet, they need to be able to tell you, I'm done. The system is used for communication and not just as a toy or a therapy tool. So one of the many issues of that communication group where it came out twice a week is it's not seen as a communication tool. It's seen as a novelty or a toy that just comes out for brief sessions. And then this is really interesting to me. The appropriate device selected is quite low on the list. So for the hours I used to spend selecting the right system for the right kid, what I now know is that so long as it's a good comprehensive system and the environment values it and everybody uses and supports it, that is a less important factor. And of course the support for the system. So a good system has a range of language. It lets them develop linguistic complexity, so they can learn to combine 2 symbols. They can learn to say more food, more go, more Jane, more singing. Everyone loves it when I sing. They can use that symbol to combine it with other things to get improved linguistic complexity. It can be used throughout the day. So when I said I can use this book in every situation, I totally can. It can be used to them to communicate throughout the day as well. And it can be used for that range of functions, and it supports them to become autonomous. And autonomy is being able to say what you want to say, when you want to say it, to whoever you want to say it. So if you ask me what I want for lunch, I can use my system to say lasagna. And if I can't have lasagna, well, I've said it. If you ask me what I want to do after this session, I could use this to say I want to go on a train. And you'd probably tell me, no, I have to stay in the room, but at least I've been able to say it. And most importantly, if you ask me if I want to do something naughty with you, I can say yes or no to that. Because I'm autonomous, I can make my own decision. So we want to build that supportive AAC environment, which I've already talked about quite a bit. We all need to know how the system works. For many of you who haven't started on this journey yet, it really seems a bit daunting. And one of the things we've learned is you need to give yourself small targets. So don't think I'm going to model this whole book or this whole system tomorrow. Give yourself a target. I'm just going to use the front page. For the next 6 weeks, I'm just going to learn that front page. And then for the 6 weeks after that, I'm going to learn the next thing. On my blog, on my website, I have a whole heap of tips for getting started with either POD or core vocabulary. There's an amazing speech in Australia of Thea Dawson, who has fabulous getting started sheets from POD that I'm sure Rosie can point you towards. Oh yeah, because they're on my blog as well. So, yeah. So, remember that us using the system is a really important key. Remember that being a supportive AAC environment is really, really critical. They're not going to become good communicators if we're not modelers. I do just want to go back really quickly and talk about that selecting the right system concept. So at the ISAC conference in Pittsburgh, I can't remember exactly what year that was. No one else? No. So that's the International AAC conference. It was in Pittsburgh, let's say 6 years ago, I think it was. 2 years before Portugal, so 8 years ago. Okay, so 8 years ago. There was an amazing presentation. So some of you will have seen that Prologue Quote Ago had its 10-year anniversary recently. So it's 10 years of AAC being available. At that stage it was just on iPhones, and then the iPad came out. The iPad in Australia was released on my birthday, May 27. I always thought that was the best birthday present anyone could give me. I'm a bit of a technology tragic as well. So, so the iPad came out and we started having more and more AAC systems on the iPad. Boston Children's Hospital has a very well thought of AAC clinic in Boston in the US, and they presented at Pittsburgh talking about the impact that all these iPads and apps have had on their service provision. So it used to be that families would come to them for an assessment. The families would have a little bit of information maybe about AAC tools, but not a lot. The therapist would make suggestions and then they'd go on this journey together. What they found was that once the iPad and all these apps came out, was that families frequently came in saying, well, we're here for an assessment, but I've already bought the app we want, and this is what we want to do. And the therapist would frequently say, but that's not the best app for your kid. This would be a better app for your kid. And so it would go in this real cycle. What they found was that then they lost a lot of the families. The families had already made a very strong decision that they wanted a particular app, and by telling them that another app was better, a lot of the families, their ability to support that was compromised by their belief in the first app. So they decided to change their practice, and they did a bit of a contract with families of let's just use this app you've already picked, and then let's do system for today, system for tomorrow. Let's implement it and see how it goes. Now the app that lots of families were coming in with was Prologue Quote Ago, and the app that they thought a lot of the kids should have was Touch Chat. And what they actually found was that in that period where they just implemented it and trialled it, was that for most kids it actually was a really good app. And that in fact they were getting better outcomes because the family was much more on board with it than when they'd made them change to a different system. And so we come back to that concept of it's not always about the best system or the right system. A good comprehensive system is important, but system A and system B, we need to look at what the environment is best going to support. Okay. And so we're going to speak AAC to talk AAC. We've got a whole heap of memes that we can use to remind people of the importance of this journey. One of the oldest quotes about AAC is from Rosemary Crosley, and it's not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say. So that's a really old quote in AAC. I had it as a bumper sticker in about 1992 on my Renault 12. I loved this version of it that someone made recently. Just because you can't speak doesn't mean you can't win Britain's Got Talent. So there's a whole heap of memes that we can use. We constantly reinforce how important aided language stimulation is. So this is a quote that I think a lot of us refer to a lot. It's from Jane Corsten, and she wrote it on a listserv. And what she talked about was that a typically developing kid has about 4,380 hours of speech input before they say their first word. If we only model AAC twice a week for 20 to 30 minutes, it would take 84 years to get the same language input. And they become a competent user at about 9 to 12 years of age, a competent communicator with speech. And if we only modelled AAC 20 to 30 minutes a week, a couple of times a week, it would take them 701 years to get the same input. And so this is what we're aiming for. We are aiming for as much communicative competence as we can get. Oh, we've lost audio again. Can you check the one that says laptop? Okay. Well, this is Georgia. You'll see another video of Georgia later today. Georgia is a gorgeous young lady with Angelman syndrome. She uses a 2-page opening pod book, and she is a fabulous multimodal communicator. She is strongly heading towards being autonomous. She can get her message across, she says different things about different people, and she uses all of the strategies at her disposal. So they're currently reading a book about busting, needing to go to the toilet, which Georgia has chosen and finds hilarious, and they're having a really good chat about the book as they read it. And so, what we know is that when we put good practice in place, when we implement a robust system, we engineer the environment, and we become great communication partners, we all work together towards that tomorrow of communication for each individual. And with those things, the sky is the limit. Thank you.